wind howls through empty caves where shadows dance against ancient walls. Silence. Nothing but the echo of death. 6 million years ago, when the world was young and merciless, there existed a tribe unlike any other. They claimed to hear whispers from beyond, voices of the dead speaking through sacred bones. For generations, they thrived in the darkness between life and death, guided by spectral counsel. Until one blood-red dawn, they simply vanished. No bodies, no struggle, no trace, except for a circle of human bones arranged in patterns that defied explanation, and the lingering scent of terror that even time couldn't erase. Tonight, we descend into the shadows of our forgotten past to uncover what happened to the Bone Whisperers, and why their disappearance might have been more than mere tragedy. It might have been necessary. Thunder rumbles in the distance. The hunt for answers begins. The crimson sun bled across the African savanna as Zara pressed her weathered palm against the skull of her grandmother. She was a female Homo habilis, her kind among the first to walk upright through this hostile world. Her dark eyes, hollow with hunger and haunted by visions, searched the bone's empty sockets for answers that refused to come. "Speak to me, ancient mother," she whispered, her voice cracking like dried leaves. The dreams grow darker. The shadows move wrong. The evening air hung thick with the metallic taste of approaching storms. Around her, the sacred bone circle stretched in perfect symmetry, femurs, ribs, and skulls of ancestors arranged according to patterns passed down through countless generations. Each bone had been blessed with blood, carved with symbols that predated language itself. But tonight something was different, terrifyingly different. The other members of her tribe huddled in the shadows beyond the circle, their eyes wide with primal fear. Kale, the strongest hunter among them, clutched his crude stone axe with white knuckles. His scarred chest rose and fell rapidly as he scanned the darkening wilderness. "The bones are silent, Zara," he growled, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. For 3 days, nothing, not even whispers. Zara's fingers trembled against the ancient skull. For 27 winters, she had served as the tribe's bone speaker, the bridge between the living and the dead. Never before had the ancestors abandoned them so completely. The silence felt like death itself, creeping through her very soul. A child's cry shattered the tension. Little Noor, barely old enough to walk, pointed toward the distant tree line with a chubby finger. "Dark ones come," she babbled in their primitive tongue. "Dark ones with no eyes." Every head turned toward the acacia forest. At first, nothing. Then movement. Shadows that seemed to flow against the natural grain of twilight, darker than the spaces between stars. Zara's blood turned to ice. She had seen these shadows before, in dreams that left her screaming into the night. Dreams of her people walking into nothingness, their faces blank with terrible purpose. "Gather the children," she commanded, rising on unsteady legs. "Something hunts us tonight. Something that should not exist in the world of the living." Lightning split the sky, illuminating shapes that defied comprehension. Tall, impossibly thin figures moving with unnatural grace through the tall grass. They cast no shadows despite the brilliant flash, and when thunder followed, their forms seemed to absorb the sound itself. The tribe's fire sputtered and died, as if the very air had turned hostile to light. The bones warned of this, Zara breathed, memories flooding back. Ancient prophecies spoken by long-dead shamans, tales of beings that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, feeding on the boundary between life and death. She looked down at her grandmother's skull one last time. Deep in those empty sockets, a faint red glow began to pulse, weak, desperate, like the final breath of a dying ember. The dead, at last, had something to say. The red glow in the skull's eyes grew brighter as Zara lifted it with trembling hands. Around her, the tribe formed a defensive circle, mothers clutching infants while the hunters raised their primitive weapons toward the approaching darkness. "What do you see, grandmother?" Zara whispered urgently. "What are they?" The voice that came was not heard with ears, but felt deep in the marrow of her bones, ancient, weary, and filled with a terror that transcended death itself. The Hollow Ones, they who feed on the breath between worlds. "We kept them at bay for generations, child, but the barriers grow weak. They come to claim what we have protected." Kale moved closer, his stone axe gleaming with the residual glow from the skull. "We fight them, yes? We are not prey." But Zara's blood ran cold as more memories surfaced, not her own, but those passed down through the bones. Images of other tribes, other bone speakers, all consumed by the same creeping darkness. The Hollow Ones didn't just kill. They erased. They fed on the very essence of being, until nothing remained but empty air where lives once flourished. "They are not alive," she said, her voice hollow with realization. "They cannot be fought with stone or fire. They exist in the spaces we cannot touch." The shadows had reached the edge of their camp now, towering figures that seemed to bend reality around them. Where they passed, the very grass withered and died, leaving behind patches of absolute nothingness that hurt to look upon. Old Jorik, the tribe's eldest, stepped forward with surprising boldness. His blind eyes, clouded with age, seemed to see more clearly than anyone's. "I remember now," he croaked. "My grandfather spoke of this night. The night when the bone speakers must choose." "Choose what?" Kale demanded, but his voice shook with growing dread. Jorik turned his sightless gaze toward Zara. "Between saving the world and saving our people." The largest of the Hollow Ones stopped just beyond the reach of their dying firelight. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of wind through empty graves. "Bone Speaker, you have kept the gate sealed for generations. But hunger grows, the boundary weakens. Give us passage, and your tribe may flee. Resist, and all will become nothing." Zara felt the weight of countless generations pressing down upon her shoulders. The skull in her hands pulsed with desperate urgency as her grandmother's spirit fought to communicate one final message. "The children, Zara. Save the children. Let the old ways die so that new ones may grow." But what her grandmother didn't say, what the ancient spirits couldn't bear to whisper, was that opening the gate would doom not just her tribe, but every living thing that walked the earth. The Hollow Ones pressed closer, their forms shifting like smoke made solid. Time was running out, and Zara faced the most terrible choice any bone speaker had ever confronted. Behind her, little Noor began to cry again, and the sound cut through Zara's soul like a blade. Zara's grip tightened on her grandmother's skull as the weight of terrible knowledge crushed down upon her. The red glow pulsing from the empty sockets revealed not just the presence of her ancestor spirit, but glimpses of a truth that had been hidden for generations. "Show me," she whispered desperately. "Show me everything." The world around her dissolved. Visions flooded her mind, memories preserved in bone and blood. She saw the first bone speakers, primitive but wise, discovering something that should have remained buried. Deep beneath the earth, in caverns that predated human existence, they had found a gate, not made of stone or wood, but of pure emptiness, a wound in reality itself that bled darkness into the world. And through that wound, the Hollow Ones had begun to seep through like poison through cracked skin. The ancient bone speakers had made a pact written in blood and marrow. They would guard the gate, contain the darkness, feed it just enough life force to keep it satisfied, but not enough to break free completely. For hundreds of generations, they had sacrificed, not just animals, but members of their own tribes. The elderly, the sick, the weak offered to the void to maintain the balance. The bones of the sacrificed became vessels for the spirits of the dead, allowing them to continue guarding even in death. The vision shattered as Zara gasped back to reality. Around her, The hollow ones had grown closer, their forms more solid, more real with each passing moment. "Now you understand," the largest one hissed. "Your ancestors fed us scraps while we starve. But the compact grows weak. The sacrifices grow insufficient. We will have our feast one way or another." Kale grabbed Zara's shoulder, his face etched with desperation. "What did you see? What must we do?" But before she could answer, another voice cut through the night high, piercing and filled with madness. It was Vera, the tribe's second bone speaker, emerging from the shadows with her arms spread wide in welcome. "Don't you see?" Vera laughed, her eyes reflecting the red glow of the skulls. "We've been fools, fighting against inevitability, prolonging suffering. They offer us peace eternal, endless peace." Horror bloomed in Zara's chest as she realized what was happening. Vera had been touched by the hollow ones, her mind twisted by their whispers, and she wasn't alone. 3 other tribe members stood behind her, their faces blank with terrible serenity. "The gate opens tonight, willing or not," Vera continued, raising a bone dagger toward her own throat. "But if we choose surrender, if we offer ourselves freely, our consciousness will join theirs. We will become part of something greater, something beyond the pain of this flesh." "No!" Zara lunged forward, but Kale caught her arm. "Let her choose," he said quietly, though his voice broke with grief. "If she is lost, forcing her will only damn us all." The dagger drew a thin line of blood across Vira's throat, and where the blood fell, the earth began to crack and split. Through the growing fissures, absolute darkness seeped upward like oil. The gate was opening. Behind them, the children began to scream as shadows reached up through the cracks with grasping, incorporeal fingers. The earth beneath their feet crumbled as darkness bled through the widening cracks. Zara watched in horror as Vera's blood sacrifice accelerated the gate's opening, reality itself beginning to fray at the edges. "The children!" She screamed above the rising sound of nothingness, a noise that was somehow worse than silence. "Get them to the sacred caves." Kale didn't hesitate. He swept little Nor into his arms and shouted to the others, "Follow me! Stay together!" But as the tribe began to flee, the hollow ones moved to intercept them. Their forms had become more solid now, fed by the opening gate, and Zara could see terrible details she wished she couldn't, and faces that were almost human but stretched too long. Eyes that held the depth of infinite void, fingers that ended in points sharp enough to cut through souls. "There's nowhere to run, Bone Speaker," the largest one said, its voice now thunder rather than whisper. "The gate opens. The hunger will be fed. All that remains is whether you will guide your people into peaceful consumption or chaotic devouring." Zara's grandmother's skull pulsed urgently in her hands, and suddenly she understood. Not just what was happening, but what had always been destined to happen. The visions returned, but now she saw deeper, further back. The first bone speakers hadn't discovered the gate by accident. They had been led to it, chosen. The hollow ones needed intermediaries, beings capable of existing partially in both life and death, to regulate the flow between worlds. But the ancient compact had contained a hidden clause, written in spiritual law older than human language. If the bone speaker line ever failed completely, if the last true guardian chose ultimate sacrifice, the gate would seal itself permanently, taking everything in the immediate vicinity into the void, but saving the world beyond. "I understand now," Zara breathed, looking at the fleeing figures of her people. They had reached the cave mouth, but the shadows were gaining ground. She raised her grandmother's skull high above her head. "Ancient mothers, hear me. I call upon the final compact." The skull blazed with brilliant red light, so bright that even the hollow ones recoiled. Every bone in the sacred circle began to glow, rising from the ground to orbit around Zara like planets around a dying star. "What are you doing?" Vera screamed. the madness leaving her eyes as she realized the magnitude of what was occurring. "What should have been done generations ago," Zara replied, her voice now carrying the weight of every bone speaker who had ever lived. "We were never meant to be guardians forever. We were meant to be the lock that seals the door." The hollow ones rushed toward her, but the orbiting bones formed a barrier they couldn't breach. Each skull, each femur, each sacred relic blazed with the accumulated spiritual energy of hundreds of generations. "You would condemn your own people?" the largest hollow one snarled. Zara looked toward the cave where her tribe huddled in terror. Kale stood at the entrance, little Noor still in his arms, watching her with eyes full of understanding and love. "No," she said softly. "I would save them, and everyone who comes after." She began to speak the final ritual, words in a language that predated human speech, syllables that tasted like copper and starlight on her tongue. The gate began to collapse inward, reality bending and twisting as the fundamental wound in existence prepared to heal itself. But the cost? As Zara spoke the ancient words, the very air around her began to tear like fabric. The hollow ones shrieked in fury and desperation, their forms becoming increasingly unstable as the gate they had fought so long to open began to implode. "Stop her," their leader commanded, but the wall of orbiting bones held firm, each one blazing with the fury of the dead who had waited generations for this moment. From the cave, Zara could hear her people calling her name. Cal's voice rose above the others. There must be another way. But there wasn't, and they all knew it. The ritual of erasure was absolute. Everything within the sacred circle, the gate, the hollow ones, the bones, and the bone speaker herself would be consumed, transformed into a seal that would hold for eternity. Vera, her madness burned away by the blazing light, crawled toward Zara on hands and knees. "Please," she wept, "I can help. My mistake, let me share the burden." Zara looked down at her fellow bone speaker with compassion. "Your part is already played, sister. You opened the way for the final ritual to begin. Without your sacrifice, I never could have gathered enough spiritual energy to complete the seal." The irony was bitter Vera's betrayal had been necessary, perhaps even guided by the same ancient forces that had shaped the bone speaker lineage from its beginning. The ground beneath Zara's feet began to crack and glow, spiritual energy building to critical mass. She could feel her physical form beginning to dissolve, her consciousness expanding to encompass not just her own life, but the lives of every bone speaker who had ever lived. Through their combined awareness, she felt the terror and wonder of her fleeing tribe, saw them racing through tunnels carved by their ancestors, following passages that led to safety beyond the range of the ritual's destruction. "Tell them," she called out to Kale, her voice now echoing from multiple directions as reality warped around her. "Tell them that we were never meant to speak with the dead forever. We were meant to become the bridge between worlds, and then burn that bridge behind us." The hollow ones made one final desperate assault, their forms stretching like smoke as they tried to escape the collapsing gate. But the ritual's gravity was too strong. One by one, they were pulled back into the void, their inhuman screams fading into nothingness. Zara felt her grandmother's presence one last time, no longer speaking through the skull, but standing beside her in spirit form. Around them, the ghosts of every bone speaker who had ever lived materialized, their faces serene despite the chaos. "Are you ready, child?" her grandmother asked. Zara nodded, tears streaming down her face as she took one final look toward the cave where her people waited. Will they survive? Will they thrive without us? "They will learn new ways," her grandmother replied. "They will become something different, something stronger. The age of bone speakers ends, but the age of humanity continues." The ritual reached its crescendo. Light blazed brighter than the sun, and for a moment that lasted eternity, Zara felt herself connected to every living thing that would ever walk the earth. All the children who would be born, all the love that would flourish, all the discoveries and triumphs that would define the human journey. Then, everything went white. When dawn broke over the African savanna, there was only silence. Where the sacred bone circle had stood, where shadows had danced and reality had torn itself apart, now lay a perfect circle of black glass. Not obsidian or volcanic stone, but something that seemed to absorb light itself, creating a void in the landscape that the eye couldn't quite focus on. Kale emerged from the cave first, little Nor clutching his neck. The rest of the tribe followed cautiously, their faces etched with grief and wonder. The children pointed at the glass circle and whispered in hushed voices, somehow understanding that they were looking at something sacred and terrible. "She's gone," whispered Jorik, his blind eyes weeping. "I can't feel her presence anywhere, or any of them." It was true. For the first time in living memory, the world felt empty, not of life, but of the constant whisper of the dead that had always lingered at the edges of perception. The bone speakers and their ancient burden had vanished completely, taking with them both the protection and the curse they had carried for countless generations. Vara knelt at the edge of the glass circle, her hands pressed against its smooth surface. "I can't hear them," she sobbed. "I can't hear anything from beyond. We single quotes alone." But even as she spoke the word alone, she realized it wasn't quite true. They had each other. The living remained, and with them, the possibility of building something new. Kale set Nor down and walked to the center of the glass circle. Though it reflected no light, he could see his own face in its surface older now, marked by the night's horrors, but alive, determined. "We can't stay here," he said finally. "This place will draw others, those who remember the old stories, who might try to break the seal." The tribe spent 3 days gathering what they could carry. On the morning of their departure, they performed one final ritual, not of death and bone, but of life and memory. Each member of the tribe placed a simple stone at the edge of the glass circle, creating a ring of remembrance around the sacrifice that had saved them all. As they walked away across the savanna, the children began to sing not the ancient bone songs their parents had known, but new melodies that spoke of sun and grass and the joy of being alive. Behind them, the glass circle reflected nothing, absorbing all light and sound and spiritual energy that touched it. The gate was sealed. The hollow ones were gone. The age of the bone speakers had ended. But in the years that followed, travelers who passed the site reported strange phenomena. On certain nights, when the moon was dark and the wind was still, they claimed to see figures of light dancing above the glass, not threatening, but protective. Guardians standing eternal watch to ensure that what was sealed would remain sealed forever. The tribe, meanwhile, had begun a new journey. Without the constant presence of the dead to guide them, they learned to trust their own wisdom, to make their own choices, to build their own legends. They discovered fire-making techniques that didn't require spiritual guidance, developed tools that surpassed anything their ancestors had imagined, and most importantly, they learned to live without the weight of ancient curses on their shoulders. Some say that Zara's sacrifice marked the true beginning of human civilization, the moment when our species stopped looking backward to the wisdom of the dead and started looking forward to the possibilities of the living. The glass circle remains to this day, though few know what lies beneath it. And perhaps that's for the best. Some doors, once closed, should never be opened again. But on very quiet nights, when the world seems balanced on the edge of something vast and unknowable, you might hear the faintest whisper on the wind, not a call for help, but a promise. We are watching. We are holding the line. You are free to become whatever you choose to be. The last gift of the bone speakers to the world they died to protect.